broadcast 9 o'clock tomorrow, and then I'll do the same thing on Thursday and Friday. Then it'll be third period. I'll stream on YouTube, and the other classes I do on Teams. But you just come in anytime you want on YouTube. And this is for next period. Then we'll do the quizzes and graded them out of 6 or out of 7. And a few of you didn't have your notes, and I said I'll give you a chance. If you let me see your notes, give you a few of those points back. Oh, sorry. And that's supposed to Rachel? Take a play. Daisy and same day we talked about. I'll just check it real quick. Oh. How they got this all mixed up? I just went down the rows and collected. It should have been. All right. So I will put them in the grade book as soon as I get the B days. And let me make sure it's streaming. So a couple things in. I'm streaming at a lower recommended bit rate. What do you want me to do? I can only do so much. Let's see if it likes that. Whatever. I should open a widget. All right. So did we get to the currency act? What was the tax that tried, and they're going to try this many times, to try to bring back the Navigation Act, just cut the tax and enforce it. The one that was an indirect tax on rum. Sugar Act. The writ of assistance was what? That they could do what without a warrant? Search. Which is really a way to harass. Just find your enemies and harass them. It's the classic weapon of a totalitarian state. And if you're thinking of creating one, writ of assistance. Okay. Just remember me. Okay, with that, and so the Trade and Navigation Act, we got the Currency Act. Oh, what said no settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains? 1763. Lots of 1763 stuff. And everyone's mad. Who is the most famous squatter of them all? Yeah, Daniel Boone. This is Davy Crockett, but he is wearing a coonskin cap, and that's what Daniel Boone wore. Hi. Okay. Yes. And I'm forgetting something else I was going to ask you. How are you doing? It's good to see you. Yeah, I won't see you for another week. I feel your pain. This is so weird. All right. So with that, let's go to get some. Did we get the Currency Act? Talk about deflation.
Yes.
Did we get to debtors went bust? By the way, deflation. You want to, anybody who's in debt, there's any deflation or low inflation, that just murders people in debt. And since today virtually everybody's in debt and we're on the edge of inflation, that's actually a major issue today. But I don't know why I put down farmers and farmers, but I want to emphasize farmers. I think I meant farmers and plantation owners. And so is this right when we quit?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was an economic depression. Still, this is not a modern economy. This is pre-capitalism. Their idea of wages, in fact, virtually everything that they thought about making a living and surviving would have made no sense to people today, just because we have a different world today. We'll get to it. It's called the Industrial Revolution, and it will literally change everything. So, we did not get to the Stamp Act. So this is the one that Britain thought they would, Britain thought that they could collect taxes, get gold, pay back their debt. The Stamp Act. And this is what we call a direct tax. So it's pretty much like a sales tax. In fact, it is a sales tax. But it's going to be a tax on all printed material. And that's, bills of receipt, legal documents. Newspapers or pamphlets would have been more common then. One that really hit people were playing cards. A deck of cards. That was the most popular game. And yes, the deck of cards then is exactly the same as today, only one deck. And all of this was a way to tax individuals. And the plan was to pay for the garrison. But it's really a way to collect taxes. But to pay for a garrison, you can imagine the colonial point of view. Why do you need a garrison? To enforce more taxes. Or to kick out the squatters. I mean, their mind could run wild with this. How do you know you pay the tax? You purchase a stamp. And this is the stamp of the royal symbol. Just boom, ink stamp. Some of them might be a pressing in wax. This, an ink stamp. You pay for it, a small little percentage, and the English thought this is a minor tax. The people in Britain were taxed all the time. And they know the colonists have been getting away without paying taxes. This is the way we'll make them pay. They really thought this was a small tax and they wouldn't mind. But any tax like this, especially a sales tax, taxes people without money, or poor people, working people, much more than wealthy people. Of course, most taxes are designed like that. Why? Who makes the tax codes? Yeah. It's not at all like that today. That's me lying. It's like that today, right now, at this moment. But this really hit everybody. Most merchants are going to be hammered because they have to pay a tax for every just bill of receipt. You're a merchant, you record everything. Everything's taxed. Most of the merchants, cities like Boston. Merchants equals more lawyers. Where? Boston. They're already mad about the sugar tax. Where? Boston. I think you get the trend here. And immediately the call went out. This will infringe on our rights as Englishmen. You're depriving us of our right to decide our own fate, to decide our taxes. And if you can tax this way, they can tax anything and destroy us. This will deprive our rights. In fact, needless to say, I don't know why I put down the colonists are fearless, because I think you understand that the colonists are fearless. I should add, sometimes I'll say, you're the colonists. And then I'll say the British. The colonists thought of themselves as British or as Englishmen. They did not necessarily think of themselves. They might have thought, I'm a Virginian, but above that, I am British or English. So I'll try not to say that they're colonists, or try to differentiate that when I need to. But they talked about this all the time. Parliament responded to their rights as Englishmen by saying, you have rights. You have representation in Parliament, but it's virtually. As Englishmen, we are all represented together. This is kind of the we, all of us together. As Englishmen, we're all in Parliament. You're represented because you're Englishmen. And the colonists, many of them were saying, we're not represented. It's only a few wealthy people in England. We need direct representation of ourselves in Parliament. Direct means we pick our own members, or a better way to look at it is what the colonists wanted. We want our own parliaments. We'll be English, but we want our own parliaments. Virtual. I'll give you an example of virtual. Every single person in Washington, D.C., almost 1 million people, they're virtually represented. They don't have a member of Congress. They don't have seats in the Senate. That's virtual. Montana technically is direct, even though we're way... Are we overrepresented or underrepresented in Montana? Congress? Do you know? We are way overrepresented. Way. Our vote counts much more than somebody in California. And I'll tell you why down the road. Eventually, I wonder if California is going to get mad. See? All right, so Virgin versus Rack. And this is the fight they're going to have. And here is a rally, soon to be a group called the Sons of Liberty, but almost immediately they're protesting the streets. And they came out, and this is obviously stylized because there's a dog. I don't know why I said that. Got to have drums, waving the flags. Here they are hanging the governor to effigy. It says the folly of England and the ruin of America. Almost immediately. It just shocked the British. Now, the British had appointed royal governors, but they didn't really have a police force. There were no British soldiers in the colonies to enforce the taxes. It was all expected to be enforced by local constables, equivalent of a sheriff. There's no police force. Those did not exist anywhere in the world yet. That will be done for a couple reasons. Mostly, the first police force in the United States, one of the reasons would be to stop Christmas. We'll get to it. They have to stop Christmas. And then other things down the road. And massive protests. But, do you remember the Albany Planting Union? They could not unify because they were bickering all the time. Well, now, the British brought them together. 9 of the colonial assemblies, especially Massachusetts, but they sent representatives to something called the Stamp Act Congress. And a couple of things about it. They would make a resolve. Now, a resolve is like a resolution. It's not a law. But it said, we stand by these principles. And these principles were, the resolution was done by a man named Patrick Henry. We'll come back to Patrick Henry of Virginia. So it's going to be called, since he's from Virginia, the Virginia Resolves. No taxation without representation. But I should add, they didn't want representation in Parliament. They would be outnumbered. What they wanted was representation in their own parliaments under the umbrella of the British Empire. But to Britain, we got to have complete control. Britain would eventually, because they lost in the colonies, these colonies would do it for like Canada down the road, or New Zealand, or Australia. You might notice something in common with those colonies. Most of the settlers most people who live there are British descent because of disease. Back to this. 8 colonies follow this. This is a big unifying factor. And the other thing they decided, they'll boycott goods. If you don't know what boycott means, is they'll quit buying British goods. If the British want to make money on a tax that would tax every bill of receipt, we won't give them their taxes, and we will drive British businesses drive British businesses into bankruptcy. We'll hit them in the pocketbook. If they want money, we won't give it to them. Boycotts are really effective. Today they work incredibly well. If people say, we're not going to buy something, or we're not going to do something, it's amazing how effective it is. That is why, how do you think people in power feel about boycotts? Despise them. Hate them. Because boycotts work. It's a Irish word. And so this is what they put down for their colonial version of the stamp. I like the skull and crossbones instead of the nice royal symbol. But here's the thing. How do you enforce people in Boston to not buy British goods? Especially when the colonies kind of depended upon the British for almost everything. How do you enforce it?
They send in those other guys that were coming into people's homes.
Say it again.
Did they send in those one guys that were just like coming into people's homes with rights of assistance?
Say it.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Did they send in those guys that just kind of like were able to go into people's houses? They had too much power.
They were eventually going to come into people's houses.
Oh.
Are you thinking of the Sons of Liberty?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. I thought they were kind of going on different. But it's a similar thing. They basically just sent people. Okay, the Sons of Liberty, organized in Boston. Sam Adams was a pretty much could do almost anything. Writer of pamphlets. He many different crafts. Sam Adams in Boston would begin to organize people, working people, who are being hit hard by these small little taxes, but they have no money, and they would enforce the boycott. How? They would stand outside merchant shops or at the docks or any place they think people are either buying the goods or paying the taxes, and they would have a little talk with them. Here's a rallying cry. True-born Sons of Liberty are desired to meet under the Liberty Tree. And they would come together and rally and talk about how we're going to enforce it. They'd find in the commons in almost every town in New England, there'd be a big open field like a park. They would drill the militia there, and maple trees are very common, so almost always personified by a big maple tree. And that became the Liberty Tree. The French Revolution will copy this. So go to French cities, they'll have the Liberty Tree. Always a maple tree. And that's a copy from the US. Well, they would meet there and talk about, okay, we're gonna go to the harbors. And anyone who is buying goods off of British ships, we'll have a little conversation with them. We'll say, you sure you want that? Let's go talk over here. And then what would happen?
Beat them up.
Beat the tar out. Anybody else want to buy anything? We're still here. So, anybody else want to buy? All right, good. We're good. That's how they do it. Was it effective? Shockingly effective. Here's the Stamp Act Congress flag. Does it look familiar by any chance?
Stripes.
No, it doesn't at all.
No.
Yeah, they kind of start building on each other. And this was the Ben Franklin's divided snake with the Albany Plan of Union. But now we're coming together with the Sons of Liberty. They're terrorists. Or are they freedom fighters? Doesn't it depend on what side you're on? Yeah. To this day. If you agree with them, they're freedom fighters. You disagree, they're terrorists. And what would they do? Here they are attacking the governor's house, Governor Amherst in Boston, and burning all his furniture. And this is a fun thing called tarring and feathering of merchants. Now, tarring and feathering is a fun little treat, which, if we ever have assemblies again, I'm just thinking it could be fun. Strip them naked after you roughed them up a little bit. They might cut your hair very nicely, take some shears and rip off your hair, and then cover you with red hot tar. If they actually covered you with red hot tar, it'd kill you. So just a little bit to burn and hurt, and then they throw tomatoes, feathers on you. That's the cutting off the hair. Why the feathers? So you look like an idiot. The whole point is to intimidate anybody else who might join into the fun.
Wait, is this just random merchants who are like, no, I don't want to buy your stamp, I'd rather go for
Anybody who is buying British goods or selling British goods.
What do you need to survive?
Huh?
What if you're like a farmer and you're just like, I kind of need the goods to like.
Well, that sucks. They put freedom first.
Oh.
We all have,
Screw
we
you,
all have
freedom.
decisions to make. You're on the right track though. It's like we all have decisions to make. You sacrifice, or you sacrifice to fight tyranny, or we'll sacrifice you. Okay, so with that, and then here they are riding them out of town on a rail. Now, a rail, this is pre-railroads, for the most part. They would use some rail, but that's, I'll jump in the gun here. Let's just say, a rail would be a long pole that would be used for fencing, a split rail fence. So basically long poles held together by kind of a cross beams and then poles stuck across. Just the old way of fencing. So you take this long pole, and it's almost always a man they're tarring and feathering, and he's roughed up, he's in pain, he's humiliated, and then they can straddle the pole. And in fact, this only shows two, but think about 3 or 4 guys on either side with this pole. And he's like this, so straddling it. And they take the pole and they lift it and jerk it up really hard. I'm not going to go through the whole anatomy issue here, but let's just say that is meant to hurt really bad. And then they ride them out of town. What is that telling everybody else who might want to buy that British pot? Or that British stoneware? You know, I'm okay. I'm okay. It was really effective. But brutal. Because once you ratchet up the violence like this, you can't just shut it off. Like all of a sudden it's over and say, hey, let's come together and be friends. It doesn't work that way. In the short run, it seemed to work though. The British repealed it. Whigs back in Parliament, they're saying, why are you doing this? The colonies were making money, and now we're destroying their economy, and they won't buy our stuff. And so the Tories in power finally agreed to boycott it. So Whig merchants were hurt. So a couple things. First off, this was supposed to be, I know it looks a little odd here, Lady Columbia. Lady Columbia was a popular figure for the Americas. And you might have seen like Lady Liberty. Imagine something like that, but they called her Columbia. Into the 20th century, that was one of the figures for the United States. In fact, to be side by side with Uncle Sam, which would more take over in World War I. But you notice the limbs cut off, being murdered by the taxes. Here's the repeal of the Stamp Act. I love all the skull imagery. And there's the Stamp Act being put into a crypt. Kind of a gruesome one. And then a teapot with Stamp Act repeal. This was actually on an AP exam a couple years ago. They had a question about this time period. And most of the students did really well, but a few came back to me after the test and said, what did boiling water have to do with this? And not just one, 3 of them said boiling water. And I said, it was a teapot for the Stamp Act. Oh, I wrote about boiling water. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But it repealed. But Tories were furious. And they responded with the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act is one of those, oh yeah? Well, we're still in charge. We can still do what we want. So shut up. That's a hint saying the taxes are coming back. And the problem is, once you ratchet up the violence, Britain, this would have been the perfect time to pull things back. Do narrowly focused taxes. Instead, they try again, and immediately the anger was at high level. Almost immediately. This is hubris. Somebody in power thinks they can do anything they want. And they refuse to back down. And they don't want to lose face. And they end up losing everything. And so with that, the next year, Charles Townsend was their financial minister in the, today, like in the United States, that's like a Secretary of the Treasury, member of Parliament. Back then they were called the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is an awesome name, Chancellor of the Exchequer. And what that means is he's responsible for raising the gold to pay back the taxes, or pay back the debt. And so,
He's like a tax collector kind of.
well, more like the minister in charge of all the taxes. Does that make sense? And so with that, they've tried one more time. We'll put a duty, that's a tax, on those old navigation, those commodities from the old Navigation Act. Just a few of them. Enumerated means just a list. They just listed out a few, like tobacco, rice, iron products. Just a few things. Drop the tax and try to enforce it. Just like the sugar act. They're going to try again. So they brought this back again. And immediately there was a reaction. But they planned on the reaction. So what they said is, okay, we'll bring back the writs of assistance. Now I talked about these, didn't I? These blanket search warrants. We'll bring back the writ of assistance. And anybody charged with smuggling will not go to a civil court with a jury of their peers. They will go to an admiralty court. An admiralty court means who's trying them, with no jury. Yeah, the Navy. They'll do it on board a ship. And the plan, that was, okay, we can't trust the mob, the colonies, we'll make sure they're punished. But to the colonial point of view, it looks like we're not going to get justice. Innocent or guilty, this court will find us guilty. Here's the reaction of the colonists, just absolute anger when this happened. And almost immediately, the tarring and feathering and the poling, hanging from a pole, throw manure at them. Once again, assemblies, okay with that. But they knew there might be trouble. So they added something called the Quartering Act. And what the Quartering Act said is, we will put troops, because there were no troops in the colonies, we'll put troops if necessary to enforce the Townsend Acts. And where will they live? Yeah, they'll live in their homes. So we'll put the guards right there. This wasn't just to save money, even though, well, you think you have to build a camp. But if you have soldiers living there, it won't be harder for them to do things like plot and organize and smuggle and boycott if soldiers are living right next to you. This is another very repressive thing. This is before they could bug and wiretap and read all your emails and everything. This was a way to do that. And so, the response was immediate, but there's one person we have to mention. John Dickinson, who lived near the Appalachian Mountains, a newspaper editor. He was not a radical, but he wrote his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. You'll see it also as a Pennsylvania farmer. He wrote not only about taxation without representation, we mentioned before, but what he wrote about, he used the word tyranny. This is what a tyrant does. And they all remember the English Civil War 130 years earlier. The bloody fight between king and parliament. And what did Parliament call King Charles I? A tyrant. What happened to Charles I? Anyone know? And he got removed. His head got removed from his body. He didn't make it. And to King George, and to the English, this looks like treason. This looks like treason. Which is interesting, because Dickinson was no radical. Relative to other radicals like Sam Adams. And they did another boycott, and once again it was effective. And what town blew up? Boston. Boston exploded. Boston is the center of revolution. The Sons of Liberty were focused there. 1768, they began to quarter troops. And a couple things about this. First off, soldiers have no money. Terrible life. Awful food. Brutal discipline. Do you remember last week when I talked about the lines of soldiers and how they would discipline them if they even turned their head? Do you remember the cat o' nine tails? Do you remember that is? The whip with 9 lashes on it? They would be brutally beat for marching out of step, for dropping their bayonet, for turning their head. This brutal discipline, tough life, no money. So in their free time, they would take jobs. Don't think of wage work like today, but just imagine doing a certain amount of work, you get the pay per amount you do. For example, a big one was making ropes. You get paid per rope you make. Rope, obviously an important thing to make in a city like Boston, a seafaring city. The poor workers in Boston who don't have any other way to make a living, like, except by making rope, and now here come a bunch of soldiers in their spare time doing the same job. What happens to the wages of workers if all of a sudden a new pool of unemployed workers come in trying to get the same job? Drops dramatically. They don't have money already, and now they're hurt even more. Same way today. What if you're the best rope maker ever? What happens to your wages then? It drops like everybody else. You're going to find out something about life. How skilled you are has very little to do with your wages. How hard you work has very little to do with your wages. What matters? What the demand is for that job, and how many workers are willing to do that job. If there's high unemployment, everybody's wages drops. Just telling you, what are happening to wages right now? They are dropping. They're dropping. We'll come back to that, but that's a tough one. It's really hard for people to get wrap their mind around. And they lived in people's homes. The officers lived in the homes of the middle class or the wealthy. But where did the private soldiers live? Think about the little hovels that the poor in Boston had. They had virtually nothing, so they lived in a little shack. 8 by 8, 10 by 10. Cold in the winter, shortage of heat, obviously. And all of a sudden now you have a soldier moving in to take your bed. And by the way, speaking of beds, what was the sleeping situation in one of these houses? How many beds were there? One. Okay, you're poor, be a board, hay, and a blanket. The wealthier you were, you might get a straw, or maybe even a straw mattress. But just a bed. So you're going to have, let's say, a family. So you have a husband and wife and 2 or 3 kids and a private. All in the same bed. And think about that soldier away from the brutal discipline of the army, and now all of a sudden he's in charge. He can do what he wants. And use your imagination. What did many people in Boston think was happening? I'm sure it did happen some. What? Husband and wife. Sons and daughters. What? Rape? Or affairs. You know, it did happen. Without a doubt it happened. But you can imagine what everybody in Boston thought. It's happening all the time, right? And soldiers, yeah, that happens. So they're just seething with anger against the British forces. This is supposed to be when the British troops first arrived in 1768. They're seething with anger. What about the poor of Boston? Where did they live? I mean, the really poor. Streets or poorhouses. Especially in winter. They would make these ramshackle warehouses about the size of this room. Just throw up some boards, drafty one spark, they'd come down. And they would pack people in, especially in the winter. How many people could you pack in a room this big? 500? They put a rope at one end, and they would string the rope at about this high, all the way to the other and pull it tight. And then about 1.5 feet another rope, and another rope. So you get ropes, that you get ropes from. You know where this is going? And every night, people didn't have any place else to stay, which was a couple thousand in Boston. They'd come in, they'd walk down the little rows with the rope, so they're all shoulder to shoulder, and then what? Sleep over the rope. They expected something better when they came to the colonies, and that's what they liked. That's what their life is. And who do they blame? There might be a lot of people to blame, but yeah, those British soldiers. And so the soldiers would be yelled at and called names. It was one of those, you're a British soldier, you don't go out alone after night. Did I say after night? During night. I guess after night would be morning, wouldn't it? You don't go out at night. Because they'd get jumped and beat up. And they would yell insults at them. And the insult that grated the soldiers more than any other one was lobster back. You're a lobster back. And why do they call them lobster backs? Exactly. It was the red and scars on their back that looked like a lobster back. That's what they called them. They were mocking them that they were getting beaten all the time, that they're nothing but slaves in the army. Yeah.
If they were slaves in the army and they were across the sea from whatever was happening, wouldn't they just kind of be like, yeah, we're on your side?
A lot of them did desert. A lot. And that was a real problem. They just leave. Every time a Royal Navy vessel would stop, there's stories of guys jumping off and hanging on the ropes and running away. And no one really knew how to swim then, so it's kind of an issue. Okay, so with that, so this is all leading to, as you can imagine, the Boston Massacre, a massive conflict. Early in the morning of May 5th, some soldiers came out to the customs house. That's where they collect taxes. They were surrounded by a mob. They were throwing manure, ice chunks, rocks at them. It was slightly organized, but also just anger. Somebody dropped their musket, and they opened fire. They should never have had their muskets loaded. It dropped, it triggered. Eventually 11 would the bell ring. Okay, got pretty good. Tomorrow what time? 9 bells. I'll be here. Try to decide if I want to be facing this way or this way. Need cutouts. I only have one cutout. Don't forget, I did assign that Zen chapter 2 as I mentioned yesterday. If you have it now, I'll take it. If not, just turn it in on Teams. Is that okay?
Wait, Zen chapter.
Zen chapter 2. Did I say 2? Sorry. Zen chapter 4. Zen chapter 4. Questions 1 and 2. Thank you for saying that. Or 2 and 3. Okay, everybody. I'm all messed up now with my numbers. I'm sorry. It's been a really weird morning. I got a list of like 30 people who didn't check out their books yet. Some of you I sent a message to you. Thank you for responding. As it turns out, the librarians are scrambling. It's tough. This is a tough time. So I have sympathy. I'll see you guys next week. You get me twice a day. You're so lucky. I envy you.
Doctor, you said you were...
How'd you do? Let's see. You're exactly right on number 3. Exactly. Good job.
It got freezing in here, Chief.
You made it. Question 40 through 52.
What? I know. That's what I thought.
I've been saying 1 and 2. I gotta quit doing that. I sympathize with you guys. You got 5 different classes. I teach 3 different classes. So
I have 7.
you have 7? Yes. Oh.
Yep.
Can I go and take your desk? I'll just put the speaker here. There we go. Everybody got a smile on the camera? Come on, look in the camera.
Oh, I wanted to do that one thing where you
No obscene gestures.
and then it sees up the